Good. So thanks for coming. My name is Heather Boone and I teach graphic design at the Visual Arts Center. And I thank you guys for coming. It's my hope that Janis's presentation will help show you how accessible self-publishing has become. And I hope that you'll use this information to make some noise. So Janis Pang is our speaker today. She's just a remarkably wonderful human being. She also happens to be a designer and educator based in Norfolk. She's been an active member of Norfolk's zine community for the past 3 years, hosting workshops in pop-up libraries to bring zine culture to new audiences. Under her moniker Good at Being, Janis bridges local zine makers and creators across 15 US cities through quarterly zine swaps. By day, Janis is a product designer at Remind, where she builds communication tools that connect educators, students, and school communities. Thanks, Janis.
Thanks, Heather. All right. I am going to share my screen. So presentation for y'all. Oh, actually, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing. Awesome. Cool, I have access. That's always the first hiccup to get over, and then afterwards, everything goes super smoothly. All right. So thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to share with you all my love for zines. And so how I'd like to divide today's event is into 3 parts. So first, I'm going to share a brief history of zines in the US. And then I'll discuss the significance of physical zines in our increasingly digital world. And lastly, I'll be sharing some of my favorite zines from my personal collection and share a how-to guide for how you can make zines of your own. And so in between each of these parts, I'll pause and see if there are any questions or anything y'all would like to chat about further. But to start, I want to lay the groundwork and answer the question, what is a zine? So zine makers commonly define zines as a small circulation, self-published work of original or appropriated text. And they're often inexpensive or free to get. And while these definitions are generally true about zines, an important part of zines' counterculture culture is that there aren't really rules, there are guidelines, but really what you want to make and how you make it is up to you as the creator. And what separates modern zines from other types of publications like comics or literary journals or other independent pubs is that a zine identifies itself as a zine. And so as the writer and zine mainer Rona Akbari notes, what you can include in a zine is only limited by your imagination. Truly, it can be any format, size, the content itself can be whatever you'd like it to be. And that's why it's such a freeing medium. And Karen Gassoni, who's the periodicals librarian at the New York Public Library, she specializes in alternative publications and zines. She echoes this statement and notes that zines allow for an element of freedom that's not beholden to anyone. And so zine creators often control every aspect of publication, from design and content of the zines to how it's distributed to the public. And so by that definition, if we want to take a look at early American self-publishing, the American poet Walt Whitman could have been considered an early zine creator of his day had that term existed. And so Walt Whitman, this dusty guy, is most famously known for his poetry collection, Leaves of Grass. And what's less known about Walt Whitman is that he didn't just write his books, but he actually made them. And so Walt Whitman was a trained printer, and throughout his life, he spent a lot of time in print shops and learning how to bookbind. And he said that I sometimes find myself more interested in bookmaking than in book writing. The way books are made, that always excites my curiosity. And so if we take a look at one of the edition, or the first edition of Leaves of Grass, he created this in 1855. And he designed the book binding, the page layouts, and chose the typefaces. He even set some of the type himself. So he had complete control over how he wanted his work to be presented. And according to the Whitman Archive, he designed this book to look unlike any previous book of poetry at the time. And so as a result, we see this green Morocco cloth that he uses for the cover. And what he did was he designed this unique stamping on the front. And what he wanted to portray here was that his poetry was hardy, alive, and growing everywhere. Because what he was writing at the time was new poetry that would represent this fertile ground of American democracy. He was very lofty with his ideas and with his poetry, and you can see how that comes to life through the way that he decides to design his books. And so he decided to not include his name in the first edition and instead just include an engraving of himself on the inside of the book. And because he wanted this to be this new democratic form of poetry, he decided that he didn't want it to be attributed to a single person, but rather to this rough representation of democracy in America. So he decided to represent himself as this very working class person who has common clothes and a hat on, which a lot of people at the time could identify with. So as a creator, Walt Whitman cared not only for the content that he was writing in terms of poetry, but how he brought that content to life for his audience. And so if we then jump ahead 75 years and talk about what makes up the modern definition of a zine, the first official zine to be recognized under that name is often traced back to the 1930s. And so the Comet was an effort by this group called the Science Correspondence Club in Chicago. And so the Comet was a sci-fi zine that started a long-lasting trend of sci-fi related zines. And so this trend grew, and science fiction fans across the country would use this medium as a forum to share their own sci-fi stories that they were writing, review one another's stories, create fan art of science fiction films or of stories that they read, interviews with writers, and really anything they wanted to include that was sci-fi related. And all of this was free from the realm of corporate publishers. What's interesting, and you'll notice this trend as I share other stories, is that a lot of zine makers go on to become official publishers. So one of the prominent zine makers actually became the publisher of the author Ursula K. Le Guin, who was really well known in the sci-fi community. And so while zines have this root in sci-fi culture, they're still pretty prominent today. So the University of Iowa recently digitized 10,000 sci-fi zines from over the 1930s. So it's still a history that's really accessible to us. And so zines during this time were created using one of two methods. The first method is called mimeography. And so through this method, we have this machine that pushes ink through a stencil and can create multiple prints of any design. And the second method, which is a little more handheld, is called hectography. And this method is also known as gelatin duplication or jelly graphing, because how you do it is you have a piece of gelatin at the bottom of a tin, and you use that piece of gelatin as a master sheet. And then by applying paper on top of it, you can then create multiple prints off of that one gelatin sheet. And so while mimeography and hectography were great for small scale runs to easily reproduce them, they weren't very practical for large scale production. So that's when we see the rise of the photocopier being so influential on zine culture. And in particular, the rise of copy shops and offices having copiers in the 60s and 70s then allowed zine makers to produce their work cheaply and quickly. And it's common in zine culture, like we have this joke that you often steal your employer's photocopier to make copies of your own zine and distribute them on the fly. So this really ushered in a new generation of zine makers. And so mass production then enabled zine makers to distribute their zines on a wider scale, which then allowed them to expand their community. And so we see this relationship between zines and the sci-fi community deepen after 1967. And so that is when the first Star Trek fanzine, Spockanalia, was produced. This fanzine actually created a lot of attention from members of the show. And so the second edition, or second issue of Bacchanalia actually included letters from the writer D.C. Fontana and actors from the show like James Doohan, DeForest Kelley, and Leonard Nimoy. And they all wrote letters as the characters that they played on the show. And so in 1968, when Star Trek was reportedly going to be canceled, the community that was established through these zines generated a letter writing campaign. So over 160,000 people wrote letters to the creators of the show to help get it back on air for another year. And so in the same way that we see zines as this medium to bring sci-fi fans together in the early 1900s, we also see it as a format that helped bring minority communities together in the 1960s and 70s. So one of those important publications is called Ghidra. And so Ghidra is named after the Japanese king Ghidorah, who is a three-headed caterpillar dragon that is one of Godzilla's arch enemies. But Ghidra was a cultural zine that was made by Asian Americans for Asian American communities. And so for some context behind Ghidra, it was a product of student protests across the country at the time. So in the spring of 1968, a group of Black, Chinese, Mexican, Filipino, and Native American students at the San Francisco State University created what was known as the Third World Liberation Front. And so this group of students organized sit-ins across campus because they wanted their university to establish ethnic studies departments that would represent their histories and not necessarily the history of colonial settlers that was predominant at the time. And so the student strike lasted 5 months, becoming one of the longest student strikes in US history. And it eventually spread to other schools across California and in New York as well. And so many of the ethnic studies departments that we have in universities today are a direct result of these student protests. And so as a result of the pressure from students, a lot of schools in California, specifically UCLA, provided funding for students to start their own organizations or publications on campus. And so one Japanese American student named Mike Murase asked the administrators of UCLA to start a publication for Asian American students. He argued that Asian American community needed a forum for creative expression and discussing social and political issues that weren't being covered elsewhere. And so the administrators responded that they could get funding, but only if the administration had final editorial say, so that they could decide what would go in the publication and what wouldn't. Since this kind of went against what Mike Murase and his friends wanted to do, they decided to start the publication on their own. And so each person chipped in $100 so that they could provide ink and printing supplies, and they ended up creating Ghidra. And so each of these issues is filled with essays, poems, and illustrations that they created. And they used it as a platform for Asian American students to read and share news about their own community. According to Murase, prior to Ghidra existing, he never saw faces like his in textbooks, except for, he would say, the one Chinese laborer mentioned who built the railroads in San Francisco. So at the time, it was really provocative because it was giving young Asian Americans a sense of belonging where they hadn't seen themselves in media and television or magazines. And so while it didn't exist prior to then, it then became a lifeline for the people that followed. And historians note that Ghidra is essentially like a DIY textbook for people who are interested in Asian American culture, because it encapsulates what people were thinking at the time and what they did in response to what was happening in the world around them. And so taking a rougher edge, but sharing similar anti-establishment sentiments, we see that zines take off in the punk community in the following decades of the 70s and 80s. And so complementing punk music, we see that zine has a really DIY aesthetic here that are complementary to the way that punk music challenges mainstream ideology. And so compared to the clean illustrations and type that we see in sci-fi zines and publications like Ghidra, punk zines have a definitively grungier DIY aesthetic that reflects the subjects being covered and that gritty photocopier method through which they were produced. So in the 70s and 80s, we see that the main hubs of zine culture became punk zines like LA, New York, and DC. And these zines would cover the seminal punk bands like we have the Sex Pistols and the Clash, the Ramones, and Joy Division. And punk zines often included what they would call scene reports based on the cities that they were based in. And scene reports would describe the state of punk music in that town or city, would also share photos from shows, would review records, and would generally critique mainstream ideology or society. And so we see these collages with funny headlines like local purple haired punks. Oh, I actually can't read what that word. Rebel against preppy look. And so we see that zines become this way for music geeks or people who identified as punks at the time to exchange ideas and take part in a larger community that may not exist directly in their locale. And in this way, we see zines becoming this like pre-internet format to create community with others who share ideas like you. And so some of the most well-known zines to come out of that punk movement was the Riot Girl zine from the 90s. And so this was a mini zine that was published every week and distributed. And it came out of a group of high school and college girls who met in DC to talk about confronting sexism and taking a claim to the white male dominated punk scene at the time. And so what they wanted to create was an alternative to male-driven punk. And they wanted to encourage young girls and women to start their own bands, to make their own zines and have their voices heard. And so some key players in that scene were Bikini Kill, who we see pictured in that GIF here. Other bands are Heavens to Betsy, Bratmobile, and Sleater Kinney. And then by 1993, which is when this was really in swing, there were about 40,000 zines being published in North America, and majority of them were devoted to Riot Girl zines and politics. And so Riot Girl wasn't just this genre of music, but became this like fuller feminist movement in itself. And so two of the prominent zines at the time, Bust and Bitch from the 90s, they actually have connections to that Riot Girl movement, but since have grown into their own full-scale magazines. And while they were zines, they were self-published, unofficial magazines that offered this glimpse into what could a world that is radically feminist, is accepting of different histories and of other subcultures that could exist and provide me exposure to something that I wouldn't have. And so zines provided then a small scale way to experiment with ideas, to share them with people who wouldn't otherwise be aware of them, and to gain a following for yourself as a creator. And so what we can gather from zines
Seems we lost Janis.
through that, you can create community by sharing zines with people who you think would share your interests or who you might want to introduce new ideas to.
Janis, we lost you for just a moment. Would
Oh,
you mind
thanks.
backing up just a tiny bit? It froze
Yeah,
at
no
what
problem.
we can gather from zines.
Yeah, okay, I will
Thank
start
you.
exactly. No problem. So as I was mentioning, what we can gather from all these trends in the US is that there are a few components of zine, there's like a core components of zine making ethos. And so we see that this DIY attitude is really prevalent in that you can create a zine with any materials you want in any format. And we also see that freedom of thought is essential to zine making because no one is telling you what to make a zine about or what content to put in it. You as the creator are really in charge of that. And A zine is also a way that we can create community with people who share our ideas or who we want to introduce new ideas with. So it's a great way to extend what you have experienced or what you would want to share with others around you. And so I'll pause here because this is the conclusion of my overarching history of zines in America, and see if there are any questions from the group or anything that y'all would like to chat about in depth.
I just had a question about the gelatin printing you talked about. How many copies would that be good for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't actually see who asked it, but I don't know the details of how many it would be good for, but that would be a great thing for me to look into and follow up with.
That was Mac.
Okay, great. And what I'll do is actually I'll write down all these questions that I'm getting, and I will send the responses to you, Heather, if that works out.
That sounds perfect. He's in my class, so I'll let him know.
You know, I was thinking, you know, I remember experiencing this, I guess, in the 80s and 90s in art school, doing these things, and I didn't know really what we were doing. You know, but I tell you, it was pretty exciting. You know, I remember putting together in printmaking, you know, using printmaking as the way to kind of put some books together, and everybody contributed a, you know, piece of work for that book, and we did that a few times, and you know, so I guess we were doing it then, and I didn't even know it really. So it's pretty cool though.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Do you remember what some of the zines or books you made were about?
Oh God, yes. I have one or two of them, you know, upstairs, filed away. They were rough and they were cool, and they were like a lot of printmaking, a lot of Xerox stuff, but I think, you know, a lot of art and anti-art kind of statements at the time, you know, kind of anti-art, I think, or art as art. And yeah, I'll pull some out. I'll share them with Heather. They're pretty great.
Awesome. Yeah, anything anti-establishment is
right.
culture.
Which I was a rule follower then. That made me nervous, but I still participated.
Got a question.
Dennis, I'm curious. Was there another question?
From Bashan.
Bashan, okay.
Are the creators usually anonymous or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. From what I've seen in the zines I've researched, they are not usually attributed to a single person, but to a collective. But in recent zines, since we can like more closely tie people to their Instagram profiles and like help gain a following for creating a certain zine, I have seen more people attributing their zines to themselves or to their internet handle so that you can find more of their work.
Because a lot of this is about rebellion, was there a point where people tried to censor this?
The great thing about zines is that they're usually distributed like on a smaller scale, in that like you are the creator of a zine, and so you pass it out to people you know. So there aren't necessarily like institutions which could stop you from doing that, at least to my knowledge.
I wanted to make a comment and ask too. Looks like some of the zines became more polished in a magazine format. So are zines still popular as they were published before, or are they now more e-zines?
Yeah, I'd say the format of zines have become more accessible, mainly because like we have a lot of history that we can now learn about in how other people created them. And we also have tools to make them more refined, as you were mentioning. Like we have editing tools like Photoshop and Illustrator, in which we can create beautiful page layouts and like decide what kind of type we want to use instead of typesetting things manually. So I have seen that while zines we have a lot more people making them. It kind of depends on how the individual wants to portray it. Like, do they want it to be that rougher, grittier style, or do they want it to be like a really refined publication? And so some of the examples I'll show you kind of run the gamut, and it really comes down to what the individual wants their zine to look and feel like for their audience. Yeah, did I answer your question? Okay.
And so I'm curious, how do you feel things like Instagram and blogs and the internet just in general are influencing this method of self-publication? Because they don't seem to be getting any less frequent. In fact, I think they're kind of flourishing, ironically, in the digital age. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I go into this a tiny bit in the next section.
Oh.
But I do find that people are still creating zines, and rather than it being distributed, like I was mentioning on that smaller scale, we do see more of like personal zines being attached to people's Instagram profiles or like art monikers. And so that way we can still trace people, or not necessarily trace people, but we can find larger repositories of their work. And so while it's not a medium that's going away, it's one that's adapting to more resources to share it being available. And so in a way, the internet's helping zine culture expand a bit more because zine creators can find each other online. But at the same time, like zines as a format are still staying intimate in these tangible things that you can help pass along.
Janis, I might be stepping into the next section with my question, but I remember last year when you came and presented to us when we were doing 340, and brought all those beautiful magazines to TCC when we could meet face to face.
Yeah.
And I recall that, you know, things started out with this kind of, like you said, kind of counterculture, rebellious, getting a voice heard kind of thing. And I think that my question is, has it shifted more into, I remember you just saying, you have something that you want to share, make a zine about that. Has it shifted into that, or do you think it's still more into the counterculture, getting your voice heard?
Yeah, I definitely think it's still in that counterculture space. I think especially in the past like 4 to 6 years that I've been following different zine creators, we've seen that people still use it as a format to share stories or experiences that would otherwise not be, well, as they define, like well received in their communities. So for example, there are a lot of queer and trans zine publications that I follow where they feel that is the space that they can share with one another what they have been experiencing, or what they would want others to know about without feeling like they would be harassed or retaliated against for sharing. So in that sense, I have seen like zines are a space where people can share openly and feel like they have that space and that platform for themselves. Yeah, but I do go into a little bit more in the next section about how zines are really this format where people can share anything now, not necessarily just like social justice issues.
You know, I was thinking, and the more, you know, that life, is described online and everything, it just seems like it makes zines even more valuable. That, you know, they're tactile, they're immediate. You know, there's this touch, and so yeah, it just seems like for a different reason. They could be really valuable in that regard. So that's just what I was thinking.
Yeah, definitely. There's something I think I mentioned earlier.
Yeah,
more
they're intimate.
about holding it.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, I see there's a question in the chat, but it might have been asked earlier about e-zines. There are some designers for publishing e-zines, and if you're interested in finding more of them, there is a site called Issue. I'll actually just look at it here. Y'all can see. It's Issue spelled like ISSUU. And this is where a lot of independent publishers, oh, this actually isn't the best landing page to show. but people will publish their own zines, like in the pre-printed format. So we get to see, like, you can flip through these zines in this format. And this is a way, rather than handing it out physically, you could still share the content of your zine online to people. So if you went into issue and typed in zines, you would find a plethora of creators.
Do you think zines have like gone down in production at all since the rise of the internet, considering people can like make memes or like YouTube videos?
Yeah, I was something like that as well.
Yeah. I would say the people who do produce zines have found even more reason to, like for the reason that you want to disconnect from the internet a little bit, or you want to intentionally create like this fuller story through a zine. And so I don't think they necessarily compete with one another, but they kind of provide respite from one another, like a little bit like the internet. All right, I will go ahead and move into the next section, which is about the types of zines that we see today. And really, there are all types, as I mentioned. And so we don't always have politically charged zines today. There are ones that are more aimed at just bringing different communities together who might share something in common. So one of my favorite ones is called Rad Dad, and it's written by parents for parents on parenting in this modern age. One of them, it is a bit more politically charged, and it's actually made by a group that's based in Norfolk. It's called Humanities Behind Bars, and they aim to get stories from inmates so that they can share their stories, and also try to essentially abolish prisons in our society, but by sharing these stories, it's a way to humanize people who are currently behind bars. And we also have publications that are focused on the cooking industry. So if you're interested in cooking with a specific ingredient or learning about different cuisines, there is very likely a publication behind it. And so we were talking about this earlier, but I wanted to point out what role zines are playing in this increasingly digital world. And so I find that zines are a way to take a break from the scrutiny of the internet, which I often find a little bit oppressive, because I think we think of the web as a place that is free for any medium expression. But at times it can be constricting because it's limiting production and interaction to likes, comments, or direct messages, which are often just like one line form of communication. And the way that I view zines, physical zines, is that it's a way to encourage people to connect with one another and form community through shared content, through interactions across multiple zines. And unlike content on the internet, zines don't get replies or hateful remarks in a comment section, mainly just because they have that physical format. And we know that publishing ideas outside of the mainstream can make certain authors or creators vulnerable, and that the web is often a place that is a bit toxic for that kind of content. So zines in themselves are this safe haven where you can share any ideas that you would want with people. And so if we were to boil down why zines are still important today, I think that zines are still about reclamation, in that you get to make your own media and define your own narrative in the way you want to and can. And zines are also, as like noted in the previous sections, they're this political and radical act. And they're a way that you can acknowledge narratives that might otherwise be ignored by mainstream media or history. And Karen Castoni, the New York Public Librarian that I mentioned earlier, notes that zines can be seen as a historical record of the moment, because to their creators, zines feel like this means of defiance or resistance to cultural norms that don't acknowledge them. And so I'm going to share one more example from further back in US history. The stretches a little further back than Walt Whitman, and this is from 1775. when the US was declaring independence from Britain, Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. And at the time, this was an extremely treasonous document because it was basically saying that we want independence from Great Britain to become the 13 colonies. And so at the time, Thomas Paine, he wrote this anonymously, similar to some of the other zines we see later in history. And so this was really documenting what the American colonies were going through at the time and why they wanted to establish independence from Britain. So this became like a little piece of history. Well, actually, it's a really big piece of history now. And then fast forward, I just want to share a zine that I was making in response to what I was experiencing at the time of the previous election. And so my friends and I decided to create a zine together called The People Have Spoken. And so for context, this was created 100 days into Donald Trump's presidency following the Muslim ban. And so 5 friends of mine across different 5 US cities, we decided to use this activity tracker app called Strava. And Strava is geared towards cyclists and runners where they can track how much activity they've been doing in any given time. But what we decided to do was to use the app to trace out different letters in a phrase and compile them together so that collectively we could share a sentiment that we were feeling at the time. And so what we ended up creating was a 12-page zine, and it started out as like this really scrappy paper prototype where I'm laying out what content do I want on each page. And then that ultimately becomes a final product with a cover, with the pages interiorly designed. And inside of the zine, as you can see, I'm flipping through the pages there, each person who participated wrote about what they were experiencing at the time and what their reactions were to what was happening in the world. And one of the participants had a really poignant quote. She said, "It's hard to reach ears that are unwilling to hear, but there's always something that we can do no matter how small." And that's kind of how I think about zines. Like they may seem like this very small kind of impermanent object because you make them and then essentially they're disposable in the sense that they're not always like works of art, but just something you want to create at the time to express how you're feeling. But even if that's small, the act in itself of putting your thoughts to paper, sharing it with other people can have a big impact. And as we see like through zine history, these things culminate over time and become this larger history of what is it like to be me in America at this time, point in history. And so what I wanted to do with zines as a format is create community through zine swaps. Heather mentioned this at the beginning of the talk. And so what I ended up doing was when I moved from California to Norfolk 5 years ago, I was finding that I was missing my friends back in California, and I was also in a sort of creative slump. So what I wanted to do was find a way that I could have a reason to create and also keep in touch with my friends. So zines were a great format for that because each of us could contribute a zine. We could each create like 5 copies of it, and then we could share them with one another. And over time, we've been doing this for about 3 years now. This has become like an established format. So the way that each of the zine swaps works is each participant makes 20 copies of a zine, and they have 3 months to do it. And then they end up mailing each of those zines to me. And then I distribute them with a group of my friends so that in return, you get a package of 20 new zines from other creators. And each of the zine swaps has a dedicated theme to it, but no rules about how you interpret the theme. So it's interesting to see how each participant interprets a theme like in between, because it's always unique to the individual, what they're experiencing or what they want to share. And so in the next section, I'll go through a few of the zines I received over the course of the swaps. But this is just a slide showcasing how all of the zines take really different formats and cover very different content. And we even have zines that from a glance don't seem like they make much sense and kind of just look like little pieces of art. But once you start interacting with them, you see that they unfold to tell a larger story. And just to give you a peek behind the curtain, this is what the zine distribution process looks like after we receive all the zines. It's very manual right now, where we lay out who are all the people that participated, and we start distributing zines one by one so that we can ensure everyone gets the right number of zines back. And then if people are joining from out of town, then we mail them back. So I will pause here, and I'm actually going to switch over to my other camera where I'll share some of the zines from my collection. And during this time, while I'm getting my camera set up, if there's anything you want to chat about, I will be able to hear you.
So I guess, are you planning on having one of these exchanges soon, or?
Yeah, so since coronavirus happened, I haven't hosted a swap. That's been my main concern is safety and like how do we ensure that these zines will be sterile. Something I've been thinking about though is we could continue the swap so long as I leave each package that I receive untouched for a few days, and then begin distributing. So that's something that I'm considering for this coming, I don't even remember what time of year it is, before the coming year, like beginning in January.
Okay. Yeah, maybe look at some precautions. I don't know. Maybe there's some little fog machine you can sort of spray out into the room, you know, while things are sitting there. It wouldn't be, there might be something, you know, something that can be done.
Yeah, that would be ideal. All right, is everyone able to hear me if I'm talking from this mic?
Yep. Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Let's see. Oh, I see that the video is still pinned on my other camera. Heather, are you able to change the pin to my other camera?
I pinned it. Can you guys see that?
Talking. Yeah, are you able to see me if I am sharing from my camera?
I can see.
Actually, I'll stop sharing.
There we go.
All right. Cool. So I wanted to share with you all a few of the zines that I've gotten from my swaps. And so to start out, I'm going to share a zine that uses the most common format, which is called an 8-page foldie. And so this is actually created from one piece of paper. I believe this one is an 11 by 17 piece of paper, but it ends up creating this 8-page story format. And so this particular zine was created by a designer named Dani Molesky, and she wanted to share the story of her family that had immigrated from Venezuela, and how she then became really engrossed in American cuisine and cooking culture. And she ultimately wanted to create her own cooking blog. And so this was a way that she could start designing and creating that content in a really low effort format, but just a way to propel her to get started on this business or venture that she wanted to create her own. So each of the pages here includes a really simple recipe and story associated with it. And then what's unique about 8-page foldies is when you open them up, you can then see the full page layout on the back cover. And so in Dani's case, she decided to then print the full recipe and instructions for each of the recipes you see in the booklet, but on the interior cover. And so then 8-page foldies neatly fold back into their original state. This one's kind of hard to see because it's such a large format, but I do have a smaller example I'll share at the end so that you can see how 8-page foldies fully expand and contract into this format. And so also on the topic of food, one of my friends from college, her name is Tiffany True. She has been hosting these food pop-ups where she pairs each of the experiences with a little zine that she creates. And so she celebrates Vietnamese food culture in her pop-ups. And so one of the zines she created was called Cooking Up Home. And she used this zine format to tell a quick story and then share what the menu would be for that evening. And so we see little illustrations of each of the dishes along with the traditional Vietnamese name for it. So this one is a small zine and it takes an accordion format like this. So all the pages can just fold out neatly and then collapse back in. And another one that we have, there was the theme that I shared in that most recent slide in between. We got a lot of personal stories from that zine. And so in this particular one, the creator wanted to share the story of her being fired from her job and what that felt like for her throughout the process. So the way that she created this zine was using transparency paper for the cover. And it looks like it says effed. We don't really know what the back words say, but once you lift up that transparency, you can see below it says fired on the cover. And so throughout her zine, this one is like very cleanly designed. We can see she's telling the story of what it was like to first be fired and all the emotions that she experienced at different stages of the process. And then it ends on a very hopeful note, like, what is it like to be fired? We should normalize that because it happens to a lot of people. And then format-wise, we see that the transparency she used on the front is something that extends to the back cover as well. So really unique story and beautiful printing to accompany it. And in that same swap, we had another person or a group of people that used transparency as well. And so this was a zine created by two Norfolk artists, Heather Bryant and Tyler Warnalis. And they collaborated to create an illustration and photography zine. This was their way of being able to share like these photos and memories that they had together and pair Heather's illustration style with Tyler's photography. And so it's a bit whimsical and just like really sweet to see how they collaborate with one another and work on top of one another's mediums. And this one looks like was professionally spiral bound. And we also, in these swaps, we have a wide range of zines. So you saw like they range in format and size and also like production quality. So someone in I believe this was a third swap that we did this handmade binding. And so if you can see like stitched in this sliver of red that goes along with his zine. And he did these beautiful block prints for each of the page. And so he wanted to do this like handmade feel because his zine was a tribute to all Indigenous cultures. And so he wanted to honor that printing method and also like binding method. And so we see a lot of Indigenous inspired illustrations, as well as certain prayers or quotes from Indigenous leaders. This one is extremely beautiful. And also sharing some stories. We had a zine from another local zine maker named Erin Young, where she was reflecting on different stories from the women and girls in her life. And what she created, like format-wise, it seems very simple from the cover. Like it's just a page folded in half and stapled. But inside is where we see the content and the way she brought the content come to life. So she interviewed 6 women and decided to document their stories. And so the way that she portrays them is she printed those stories on the top halves of the page and drew faces along with them, and with the bottom half of their faces on the lower half of the page. And so these are actually interchangeable, where you could flip through different stories on the top and different lower halves of the faces below. And what she wanted to communicate with this particular format is that while we are each unique in that we have our own stories, there are a lot of shared themes among female stories. So she wanted to create unity, but also recognize what makes each individual unique. Taking a look at some other really unique formats. This was one from the most recent zine swap in between as well. And it's actually very tangible zine format. It starts out in a matchbox. And what's amazing is that like each of these creators have to make 20 copies of their zine. So this person made like 20 of these little matchboxes. And then the title here says Lost in Between. And these are actually cut out slits on the top. And so you can push out the zine or the box, and then it actually reveals the fuller zine content inside. And so with this particular zine, the artist Kai Ying, she wanted to share the story of what was happening with people who are immigrating from Mexico to seek asylum, or immigrating from Mexico to the US to seek asylum, and what kind of challenges they were facing through the process. And so it just tells the story as you unfold the pages inside. And in the interior of the box, you see this really touching illustration of a family huddled inside. And so you have this very neatly contained zine format, and it all comes together through this matchbox container. And it matches the content really well because we see the story being trapped behind bars, which matches what she wanted to share about people that were seeking asylum. And one more unique format, this is a deck of cards. With this particular zine swap, I noticed people just really went all out with their production, which is awesome to see. And so this zine collection is called Ace of Hearts. And with this particular zine, the creator included a small pamphlet inside to introduce the fuller content. And in it, she talks about her experience dating as someone who is asexual and what it was like being on dating apps like Tinder and trying to match with people. And so she then included these playing cards of different people that she matched with that are just like very entertaining to read through, because you start to see like, oh yeah, these are all different like internet personalities that people use on dating profiles. So this was her way of instilling humor into a situation that she experienced every day. So zines are a great format to just like remember who you are, what you're experiencing at any time. And they're also a great way for people to remember you later down the line. So if any of you knew Brian Villon, he was a teacher at TCC who passed away this past year. And when I was looking through zines for this workshop, I found this zine that he shared with me last year. It's called Exposed. Brian was an amazing designer and creative, and so he's always coming up with very clever names for things. So Exposed was his photography zine. And in it, he just documented all of these random memories that he had with his friends from parties. And I particularly love this spread, where we get to see one of the projects that him and his friends are working on for this organization called Fantastic Planet. And so we get to see like the inner workings of some of his projects and what it was like to be there in that moment. And so it's really beautiful. Like, even though I don't know who all of these people are, I don't know like what moment this was, I do feel like I get to see a little bit of life through Brian's eyes, through his zines. and I feel connected to him in that way. So I love having this zine and knowing that he created it to commemorate this particular time in his life. And with that, I'm going to end the swap, or end the show and tell, by showing a zine that I've created. And at the time, I was feeling very like pensive about life. I was like, what do I really want to do? And so I ended up creating this like zine with a bunch of prompts for myself. And my friends found it helpful, so I ended up creating a bunch of them. And I distribute it under the name Good News because my business name is Good at Being. And so I wanted something that played on that a little bit. And so the zine is called It's Never Too Late. And through the zine, there are some different activities to go through just to think about what in life do you want to do? And so the initial prompt is, in the end, how do you want to be remembered? And with these zines, I included little pencils that people could write in the zine as if it were an activity book. And then going through it, there are just some other prompts to think through. How do you want to be remembered by others in your life? How do you want to treat your own body and be good to yourself? And then this uses the 8-page foldy format. So when you then open up the zine, you get a fuller poster in the back. And what I included here were just some other reminders to myself, like other mantras about what's important to me in life. And so this is a really great format because it's easy to make and you can jam pack a lot of information into an 8-page foldy. And it's easy to distribute because it just folds into itself so nicely. This was also the zine that Diane pointed out earlier, I believe. So it's great to know that you still have it around. I see that we have just a few minutes left. So I'm going to hop off of this video and then go back onto my camera. All right. I just want to see if there are any questions or anything y'all want to discuss based on what I chatted about. Otherwise, I do have like a really short tutorial guide on how to create an 8-page foldy, but I'll see like what time allows.
Janis, Nancy would like to know if someone is not in a zine swap or a zine community, how can we find where physical zines are being distributed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not sure of anywhere in Norfolk that has like a library available. There are a lot of public universities that have their zines digitized. I can come up with that list and send it to you, Heather, if you'd like to share it out with everyone.
Perfect.
Yeah, and in terms of physical zines, we do have a Norfolk Zine Festival that happens every year. I am pretty sure it's not happening this year. It usually falls sometime in the fall. But
right now, usually.
Yeah, it's usually right about this time. But they're on Instagram if you want to follow along and see what they have planned for next year. And that's a zine festival that brings some creators locally and also from like the greater Virginia area. So it's a great opportunity to see what are people outside of this immediate community creating.
Tom wants to know, he said he had to run, but he wants to thank you and he wants to know when is the next swap and what is the theme?
Yeah, that is a great question because I always think about that too. I would love to start them again in January. Biggest concern for me is just safety and making sure we don't contaminate anything or anyone by doing a swap. But what I've done in the past for like New Year's theme swaps is something related to like self-reflection or looking forward. What do you want in the next year? Like, what do you want to see in your own life, in your society or your community? Just as a way that we can create something that we're looking forward to.
Definitely let us know so we can let the folks know who are here today if they'd like to participate.
Will do.
Any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat.
Actually, I have one. Is it, can a zine be copyrighted? Or, I guess I'm not sure if I'm saying that, asking the question right.
Yeah. Like, can you ensure that people don't take your zine and reproduce it or like take any of the content?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have read an article and I will forward it to Heather to share with you all, but it's all about how to distribute your zines and if you want to license it, how you can go about that too.
Okay.
Oh yeah, what's your name? Jessica?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm just taking down names so I know who to reference when I share all these with Heather.
Thanks, Janice. I think it seems like we're out of questions. Did you say you wanted to share one last thing?
Sure. If there's time, I can share really quickly the format for making an 8-page foldy, like I shared in the earlier examples. I just need to grab a piece of paper. All right. So you can start out with any blank sheet of paper, whatever size you want it to be. And what you do is you fold it first in half, hot dog style. And then you open it up again and you fold it hamburger style. And then once you have those 4 folds, you then take the edges of that hamburger and then you fold them in towards the middle. And so right now I have 8 distinct sections. And what I like to do, just to make sure that everything will like fold properly, is I just fold the creases back onto themselves so that they are super crisp. So I still have just my 8 creases. And then I'm gonna take a second. I'm actually gonna point my camera downwards so you can see what I'm writing. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
All right. And so this is the order that an 8-page foldy takes. This is your back. This is the front. This is page 1, 2, and then you have to turn it upside down. And then you get 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then on the back, where I currently have like a bunch of notes written, this is where your poster or interior content lives. So when someone opens up that 8-page foldy, what do they see? And then I'm going to need a pair of scissors or a knife. So I'm going to use this kitchen knife that I found because I didn't bring a pair of scissors with me. And what you end up doing is cutting this slit right here from this middle down to this point here. So I'll quickly do that and hopefully not cut myself or anything else. All right. Yep. So I just cut through the middle there. And what you do now is you fold this in half, hot dog style. And then you make sure that the slit is still open. And then you push outwards from the middle. And it folds into a little booklet, kind of by itself. You might have to like refold some of the pages to make sure that they crease nicely. But now we have our front cover, page 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and the back. And then when you open this up again to full size, you're going to get your poster. So like very easy to create. I think the most time and effort goes into planning what you want to be on each page, and then to make sure you formatted your design correctly so it prints, even though like some of the parts are going to be upside down if you're designing it in this like flat format. But otherwise, it's a really flexible medium, and I love making these. They're so easy and so cute because they fit in your pocket.
You wouldn't happen to have a template of that, would you?
I don't, but I can share one.
That would be lovely. You can make a zine out of that. the zine about making the fold
Yeah.
for the zine.
That'd be very meta.
So meta, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Nancy says it was great. She loves how it's subversive and anti-establishment possibilities of this medium. Bonnie says thanks and wants to know if you're still at Grow.
Oh yeah, happy to answer that. I am no longer at Grow. As of 6 months ago, I now work at an education startup called Remind, and I'm a product designer there. So a lot of my day-to-day is not spent in the zine world, but in creating like digital apps and interfaces.
Grow in downtown and as in Norfolk.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I actually tried to apply for a couple jobs with them a while back.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I believe they're still, actually, I don't keep up with their hiring, but they're always looking for designers or interns, and yeah, other roles on their site.
Thank you so much, Janis. This has been great.
Yeah,
In front of,
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
thanks you guys all for coming.
Really great.